Do you know what I reckon that is one of the key drivers of disaster in politics is fear. People fear the wrath of the electorate. And as soon as you're frightened, you're not willing to do stuff. And they've done some great stuff on housing and some great stuff on climate. How do you sort of, as I would sometimes describe, make a pig of yourself on those? How do you make a splash about them and be willing to take heat? In fact, court controversy show that you connect with people and are fighting for them.
This week on Socially Democratic, my guest was campaign researcher John Armitage, and he sat down with me to do a vibe check on the Labor Party and the voting public. We actually intended to cover both the Werribee by-election and talk about messaging for the two major political parties in the lead up to the federal election, but John is so passionate and his energy is so infectious and his Zoom background is so alluring that we actually spent the whole hour just talking about the Werribee by-election, which, as our listeners can probably guess, is about far more than one single district in Melbourne's outer west. So let's dive in after a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well, and you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month, and you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift, so if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. All right, we are taping this one on a Tuesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining him on the line today is a bloke that has actually been on the show a couple of times. You may have remembered him from some of our episodes. I sound like Troy McClure. You may remember him from some of our episodes on the Voice referendum campaign. And I've always been wanting to get John back. He is the head of Kudos Research. He's a researcher in Qual and Quant. I've worked on a bunch of campaigns with John, all successful ones, I will point out. When John and I get together, we don't lose. And I'm pleased to have him back on the show today. John Armitage, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Great to be here, mate. Thanks for getting me on.
Look, you have the times you've been on the show. A lot of our guests really put a lot of effort into their background for physically the physical background that they present, and you tend to take more of a laid back approach. I just feel like today you're really trolling me by being in the garage and just letting everyone know that you have a car.
Yes, my luxury vehicle, 2012 i30. In fairness to me, I have just moved house as of first night here in Thornbury, having moved in from the outer suburbs at the back of Melbourne. So I'm not entirely unpacked, and I promised to get a picture that I can sort of drop down and make it look like I've got a fancy.
Oh, no. John, don't go changing. You do you, right? Like, I know you're trolling the podcast and that's fine, but I just want you to lean in on this, right? It has to get better next time, as in it has to get worse. I want like a fire in the background or something. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so initially we were going to get you on the show to talk about federal politics. Our intention is to do that, but obviously over the weekend there was huge news, massive upset. Glasgow Rangers lost to Queen's Park in the Scottish Cup. A lower division team bundled them out at early stages. Huge news out of Scotland. John, your reflections on the game. I'm only joking. That literally was for Joe Lockery, one of our listeners, massive Celtic supporter, and I'm still glowing at the fact that Rangers lost to Queen's Park, a team that was an amateur football team up until about 10 years ago. So there you go. The oldest club just beat the newest club. No, that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Werribee by-election that happened down here in Victoria. I've been getting lots of messages from folks interstate saying, Stephen, what does all of this mean? And instead of me typing back to them in WhatsApp groups, I just thought I'd do a podcast about it and do a bit of an unpacking of it. Before we do that, though, John, I was going to give some folks from outside of Victoria a bit of an overview of sort of where Victorian politics sort of is, and I want to get your reflections on this as well because I may be a little bit off. But if you look at the published research polls into state politics, the primary vote for Labor has slowly declined since the retirement of our great leader, Daniel Andrews. That happened in September 2023. At that point, Labor's primary was at 39 in the published polls, and our two-party preferred was 58-42 against the Tories. The first time that the Tories caught us on a 2PP was in May 2024. It was 50-50, and our primary was at 27. And obviously there was a Resolve poll that came out over January that had Labor's primary at 22, and the Tories were leading 55-45 on the 2PP. So it's just interesting to see this slow decline of Labor's primary and our two-party preferred in a period of time where not a lot's really happened in politics. I don't think the Labor Party or the government's in the papers that much. I don't think that there's that vitriolic kind of hatred that was emanating from all of the rags, really, the Age and the Herald Sun about Daniel Andrews. It's been pretty passive. I think a lot of folks, anecdotally, you talk to people out in the community, they don't know that Jacinta Allen is the Premier. So what do you think's bringing this dip in Labor's fortune, certainly in these published polls?
I think the thing about polls is that, you're asking people to make a judgment on a pretty close sort of a choice. Look, I haven't got a whole lot of qual to back this up, but my suspicion is that what's going on is that you remove Daniel Andrews. Remember, last time he got 58, Victoria's been a good state for Labor. Since the turn of the century, we've averaged about 54 at state level, 53 at federal. But that 4% is a lot. So, that's probably Daniel and pandemic and so on and the way that he managed those things. And what happens these days, state politics is pretty low profile for an awful lot of people. So you take out a really high profile leader and you replace it with someone, very competent and good in many ways, like good communicator like Jacinta Allen. The public hasn't really noticed. They might be sort of vaguely aware that she's there, but they have not got a sense of the person. And so in the absence of that, you find that a good leader that's well regarded is a bit of Teflon in the sense that negative won't cut through as much and positives are easier to sell. So you remove that out. I don't get the sense that Victorians want to beat up on the state Labor Allen government. I just get a sense that they don't really have a sense of what that government really is. And then you put into the context of that cost of living. This is pretty usual thing that happens around the world. Incumbents are always going to have trouble when the economy, not so much economy, when cost of living is a better exact term really, because when economy gets into your household and starts causing you grief, that's difficult for governments. Donald Trump is a pretty unimpressive person and candidate in almost every way you could measure. Even he managed a narrow win in the context of an economic sort of decline over there, obviously very different circumstances. So I think that we would reasonably expect that if you sort of then take that over to that Werribee by-election, well, actually, before we go there, you might reasonably think that some of that 58, you've got the loss of a popular leader or I shouldn't probably say popular, that's probably a shabby sort of term in a way, a leader whose values we knew and understood and saw him as a man who was in our quarter fighting for us. So you take that away and replace it with something we haven't quite figured out yet. And then you've got cost of living. I would have thought that 8% is up for grabs in a context like that. So your 58 becomes 50-50. I reckon that's sort of credible, really. Not happy about it, but credible.
So then we come to this Werribee by-election, an outer metro western suburban seat that's been in Labor's hands for a number of years. Look, the name's changed. It's been abolished. It's been merged into other seats. But basically that Werribee community, whatever the seat they've been in over the course of since 1979 has been red. And it is emblematic of sort of the western suburbs of metropolitan Melbourne that has been a Labor heartland for a very, very long time. It was held by the outgoing Treasurer, Tim Pallas, who retired, thus causing a by-election. Labor held the seat with a two-party preferred margin of 60%, 45% on primary. Labor's candidate in this election was John Lister, who had a swing of 16% against the Labor primary on election day, 8% of that going to an independent, and we'll probably talk a bit about him in a moment, and 5% of that going to the Trots. Only 3.7% of that primary swung to the Liberal Party, but in the end, on a two-party preferred basis, it was a 10% swing to the Libs. As we speak, and as I said, it's Tuesday morning, Labor has a 441 vote lead, and there is obviously a recount to be conducted just because it's so close. Plus, there are some remaining postals to come in. My sources tell me that both on the Liberal side and on the Labor side, that they don't think that will be enough to overturn this lead that Labor has. But I'm a naturally cautious person when it comes to elections, and I certainly don't want to knock the electoral gods and say that this is in the bag for Labor. But it's looking likely that Labor will hold on to this seat. Just going into this actual campaign, John, how did you feel about Labor's chances in this by-election? Because I think there were mixed feelings across the party. Some people thought that Labor were going to lose, and others were like, "Oh no, we'll be okay here." And I just want to get a sense of what did you think about Labor's chances or fortunes heading into this poll?
I'm happy we got over the line. If we indeed have got over the line, Stephen, take a win, really. Look, I think there's all kinds of things happen with by-elections. I talked about that context of we haven't got the leader whose values are well understood anymore. We've got cost of living crisis. Then you've got a pretty good, long-standing, very high-profile treasurer sort of. Well, actually, for a treasurer, probably not that high-profile. Tim always thought that keeping economic and fiscal news out of the news was probably a good thing. But, good fella out there for a long time, well known by people. It's not that unusual to lose I think 5% stock standard for a by-election against a government. So to lose another 5 in the context of the other two factors, I think would have been in the range. And if we hang on, I'll be very happy. And I suppose, look, at the end of the day, we always like to get a win, and it does matter to us. But in the context of the number of seats Labor's got in the lower house, doesn't probably matter that much either way. It's more of a psychological boost or not. Obviously, completely different with John Lister, who's hoping to have be in the parliament, and that's always very important. And it does sort of matter psychologically. Keep in mind too, out Werribee, particularly people who aren't from Victoria, this is a really, really rapidly growing area. You've got a huge number of migrants, particularly subcontinent migrants are moving in. You've got a massive amount of growth. This is the bit of, if you look at in a radial direction out of Melbourne, Melbourne can just expand its suburbs in any direction it wants. It's not physically constrained by mountains. And it just never really did in the sort of, I suppose, the southwest almost just never really grew. Well, it is now. And that always puts a huge amount of pressure on services and they don't keep up inevitably. So, look, I'm really glad that we've got over the line if we have. I just want to sum up the way I was just having a look at the numbers, excuse me for looking at my other screen. But, yes, thing you can't ignore, that 16-17% against Labor primary, that's a big deal. That is not explained by by-elections and the incumbent being gone. I don't even reckon it's explained by the cost of living stuff either, right? It's not. So there is an issue here for us about campaigning in and looking after outer suburban sort of, middle class, even lower middle class people that are struggling, young families. It's never more economic pressure on your family than when one partner is at least part-time out of work as you're having kids and you've got the big mortgage, etc. So let's not. We must face that 17% swing and look it in the eye and be honest about some real issues and what we're going to do about that and reconnect with those people. Keep in mind, remember the last state election, it was about, off a good base, it was about a 5% swing even further towards Labor. But if you looked at these sort of seats like Werribee, what was the swing? It wasn't. It stayed still. Now, if the whole state's moved 5 and all these western and northern suburb seats, they didn't move much at all. Some of them even went backwards. Melbourne was a bit of an exception. Issue with the candidate there. But generally speaking, there has been we nearly won Brighton, Beaumaris, Hawthorn, and to people interstate, that's stuff that you just call blue ribbon Liberal stuff forever. We got within 1% or 2 of those. The big shift that's going on in Australia, and we saw this with the Teals last time, is that upper middle class white people, educated upper middle class white people, are shifting towards Labor, and less educated people in the outer suburbs, the sort of people we traditionally represent, have not been sticking with the Labor Party as much. But so that's all legitimate context. But let's just break this down a little bit, left versus right. And I know this is never quite right, because someone might be very green but right-wing on other things or whatever. But if you add up the swing, the primary vote swing, Labor, Green, Victorian Socialists, Cannabis Party, Animal Justice, that's actually only a swing against the left-wing parties of 8. 6 of that goes to the Libs and 2 goes to an independent. But so, okay, that looks pretty normal in a by-election context, right? That doesn't stand out too much. But this fella, Paul Hopper, ran last time, got 6, ran this time, got 15. Good on him. What a great swing. Have a look at his platform. There's nothing right-wing about it at all. He's talking about wanting better services for people in the West, better roads, better public transport, better schools, better hospitals, better sporting and social facilities, right? Here's a fella standing up for local people in his area for the things that they are correctly identifying as inadequate, which always happens when a population grows. So, I just don't think the Liberal Party gets a swing in the context of all of these things. The Liberal Party itself gets a swing of about 4. It didn't do any better in Prahan, by the way, a bit of a harder seat to read. But the other by-election down here. But you'd hardly say that people in these outer western areas are looking to a right-wing Liberal Party to be the answer. They're just wondering whether Labor's in their corner. And I think that's probably the key lesson we're going to take out of this.
I was going to talk about the Libs a bit later on, but let's do that now because you just touched on it. Maybe we can come back to some of the areas in which Labor can probably address the problems that you just highlighted there. But, both Dutton and the Victorian Libs have been talking up this strategy of almost conceding areas like seats that they lost to Labor in the southeast and down the Sandbelt. Maybe some of those seats that were their blue ribbon seats that they lost to the Teals. There's an argument there. They're saying that if there's a seat that's been held by a Teal that is a notionally liberal-looking person, then they don't think they'll win that one back, but they can win back seats where they think the seat has been held by someone who looks left-wingy, like sort of a Zoe Daniel in Goldstein. And at a state level, you can get a sense that the Libs are not even trying to win seats back in the regions in Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo. And so where they're really putting all their eggs, not all their eggs into this basket, but they're putting a lot of their eggs in this particular basket, is these outer suburban Labor heartland growth corridors, sort of the outer southeast and the north and the west. And they've been talking this up. And it's not just in Melbourne, it's in Sydney and Brisbane as well at a national level. And I think that the Werribee by-election presented what I would call a perfect storm to test this strategy. If there was ever a moment that you were going to win a seat in Melbourne's West, it was now. And you talked about some of those conditions, like long-term government, polling in the 20s, tough economic conditions, specifically impacting that voting base that you're trying to appeal to. By-elections are just notorious for upsets. Questions about the previous candidate or the incumbent and how much, this came up at the doors. Like I had volunteers tell me, they were talking, when you door knock folks, they were talking about government services, crime, and I hadn't seen my local MP. No disrespect to Tim Pallas, great servant of the movement, but he was a minister and he wasn't, he couldn't do 2 things at the one time. We can talk more about that another time. But anyway, so that was coming up on the doors, right? So these are the conditions of which if you're ever going to jag a seat in the West for the Liberal Party, this was it. And they got a 3% swing to them on their primary. And the question I ask is that all you've got? Like, really, is that it? That's your crack. That your whole strategy, and you got 3% swing. Like, piss off. Like, you are not fair income. And I spoke to some folks in the Liberal Party during the week, and they were like, our candidate was shit. We have no infrastructure out in the West. We never have. We're struggling to get any kind of foothold out there. This is a charade, this whole outer urban strategy. So, for the Labor Party, I'm not saying that this is papering out. Well, I don't want to paper over cracks, and we'll talk in a minute about Labor has to learn from this, and we'll go through a bit of that in a moment. But just to point out to the Liberal Party, like, come on, like, get real. Like, You can't win this one. You're not going to win Point Cook, and you're not going to win Thomastown, and you're not going to win Broady. And, these seats, there's got to be more than just what you've given us here, basically, is my takeaway from this anyway.
I think that the New South Wales Liberals would have done better, and the Queensland Liberals would have done much better again, or LNP, I should say, up there, because they understand the nature of that sort of campaigning, right? The Liberal Party in Victoria has always been this sort of inner city, sort of terribly urbane, sort of very sort of white, very sort of comfortable sort of suburban party. And partly, I really think that the strategy of shifting, allowing yourself to lose all of these inner city seats because you're not connected to educated people that are not going to buy your rubbish on climate and your rubbish on COVID vaccines and your sort of misinformation about immigration, etc. Because although I've been referring to upper middle class white people, they're not particularly racist. They're not homophobic. They're not anti-trans. They're not sort of religious fundamentalists, right? So these people are just looking at the Liberal Party and going, well, hang on, what way do they represent me? So economically, I think in terms of perhaps a slightly hostile to unions and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, I always say the upper middle class white people of the inner city think they worked very hard to inherit their economic advantage, and they don't want you sharing it around with someone else. So, I think the Liberal Party of old can sort of connect with those people, but this whole sort of, Abbott, Dutton, Morrison brigade, starting with Howard, of course, and this really sort of almost pitching to this sort of base racism and redneckery whenever they can, and this simplistic sort of approach and really sort of simple, blunt attacks. It just is not going to wash there. So they've gone, well, okay, so we're going to get a toweling in the inner city, which is their actual base. Like, if they win government federally with 80 seats, 60 of them will be in that sort of area, right? The relatively comfortable suburban places. And yet the other 20 that they tend to get, which is the sort of outer suburban regional sort of centres, like particularly in Queensland, that's 20 of the 80, right? But they're just saying, well, we can't afford to lose them because you always count the seat that got you over the line. It's like the goal that you kicked at the end. Well, that's not really the one that won the game for you. It's the 6 you kicked, before that count just as much. So they've made that strategic call, and I think in Victoria in particular, the Liberal Party does not know how to capitalise on that. But they are in no position to reconnect with educated people in the inner city. And how can they? How can they have Dunn as their national leader? I can't even remember the name of the state opposition leader at the minute, but most people probably can't. When you've got that sort of, I would call it more of a sort of an orange brand of the Liberal Party. It's really the Liberal National Party movement is really the Liberal National One Nation Murdoch movement these days, or Sky News movement. And there's just no room for a sensible, intellectual, sort of inner city, educated, reasonable, science-believing in member of the Liberal Party as an advocate. And then exactly as the Lib said, no infrastructure out in the West. Look, I do think it is still a risk for us. It is clearly the strategy the Libs are going to go down. And I personally find a little bit of a moral sort of conundrum for Labor a bit. So hang on a minute, we're losing poor people, right? People who are less well off, people who are struggling, people who are getting crappy paying conditions in the outer suburbs, and we're winning upper middle class white people in the inner city. I mean, I'm glad to have their votes. Thank you. I think we are the best party for, on an intellectual and educated sort of way. But I don't know quite how I feel about it. Perhaps we could talk a bit more about where our federal strategy should be. But anyway, that's my sort of sense of the Liberal Party's conundrum and how they clearly have decided to resolve it. This is not a rapprochement between the moderates and to try and win back those teals. They've given up on that. They might get a couple back for different reasons, but they pretty much decided to be a party of the angry redneck, really.
Let's turn to, I guess, how does Labor respond from this moment? Because we got a scare. And in some ways, not that at the top of the show, you sort of talked about this probably isn't this is probably not a bad outcome, because to win well for Labor kind of papers over some of the cracks. To lose is shocking because we just lost a seat. We don't want to do that. And it can be a bit of a mental scar on the caucus and on the wider party. But to win and just win isn't a bad thing. Actually, I'll give you an example of why I think this is a good thing. And I noticed before the election itself, a lot of media and social commentators were bringing up their own by-elections as a prediction of what the future will hold for the Allen government, and saying that, John Brumby won the Williamstown and Albert Park by-elections and then went on to lose the 2010 state election. I was a campaign manager on the Williamstown by-election, actually, which is quite funny that he mentioned that. But at the same time, Daniel Andrews lost the Northcote by-election in 2017 and then went on 12 months later to win in a landslide the 2018 state election campaign. Interesting one. I know it's a while ago, but my one I throw up is the 2001 Aston by-election, which is showing my age. And John, I know you'll know what I'm talking about as well. In which, and setting the scene here, was a by-election which was a really, really important test for the then federal Howard Liberal government, because the government had introduced the GST just over earlier year before. It was incredibly unpopular. There was a lot of unpopular sentiment surrounding the government. They'd lost government in Queensland and in WA in landslides. The Liberals had lost the seat of Ryan in a recent by-election. Kim Beazley was ahead in the opinion polls. And I remember going out to Aston thinking, and Kieran Boland was our candidate, and I was thinking, we're going to win Aston, and then we're going to go on and win the federal election. And the Libs hung on. They won with a swing of 3.66% against them, and they won by 908 votes. And then John Howard went on to win the next election and the next one after that. So like I said, we can all pick our by-elections that can predict the future. And I guess there's a lesson that you need to learn from this moment. And I want to get a sense from you about what are the key lessons, or where do you think that state Labor needs to learn these lessons? I've heard plenty of hot takes with this swing to the cannabis party. There's discussions apparently in the party that we need to legalise cannabis. I don't think the fact that a whole bunch of disenchanted voters park their vote on legalised cannabis means that they now want to smoke the chronic. I think we're sort of reading into that a bit too much. There's also this argument that we need to turf the suburban rail loop project and invest in other projects. In doing so, as someone pointed out on Twitter the other day, you were then basically going to, and I said this last week in the show, you're just jettisoning a whole bunch of swagger seats that we currently hold in the eastern suburbs. So, yeah, sure, let's just give up the east as well as potentially not support the west. So there's a whole bunch of hot takes happening, but I want to get a sense from you about what do you think Labor needs to take from this close result in order to get itself set for the state poll in November 2026.
I could talk at sort of two levels, one at the sort of state level and at the local level, perhaps at the local level first. Local candidates and local MPs have got this one-word job description for a politician: advocate. The fact that you've been in government for 10 years does not stop you being an advocate for everything that is not working for people. Just because you've been in government doesn't mean you have to be an apologist for every ambulance that's late. You're angry about it. You want to get it fixed. You're campaigning for it and the positive thing that you want to fix. And so I just think actually working really hard, listening to people, being out and about, being known in your local area and working hard is and listening and advocating and being seen to advocate for people is really important. I would say at the state level, and this is more about leaders than anything else, I think, and I think we could look at this around the world too. If a candidate is going to win, then they're going to win because it is that their values are clear. And to take a step back from that, even again, so many times I've done so much research about so many things and listened to people, and you put messages and ideas and policies to people about a whole range of things. And a single repetitive truth always comes through in it. Most people, and this is absolutely not a sledge on their brains or interest or values, most people have neither the time, inclination or capacity to properly assess everything that's going on in government, right? So in that context, there's one thing that cuts through. Someone's values are writ large by what? Controversy. Steve Crabb, very successful, minister and campaigner for the Labor Party in Victorian government of decades gone past, once said to me that if the only way that you will get known is by your controversies, If you do not manufacture your own controversies, then you will only be known for your cock-ups that are big enough to be controversial. And so what you're looking for at a leadership level, really, and as a real strategic proposition is, what are the things that, and I genuinely don't necessarily mind. I think you could legalise cannabis. I wouldn't scrap something popular like the suburban rail loop. If you want to legalise cannabis, do that. If you want to do something radical about, well, I shouldn't say radical, but something big and dramatic about climate change, if you want to do something and make a splash, I almost don't mind what it is, but be clear about that is a platform to showcase the values of the leadership, right? And then we look and go, I know that person is in my corner and fighting for the things that I believe in. So you're looking for controversial things in order to be able to create that themselves generate the energy and the discussion. And then at the end of that, it's clear what you believe in. Look, you can do things that are unpopular and make that happen. If you were to, arguably Howard did that on the GST, right? GST was unpopular, but he said, he will always put the economy first. And he nearly lost 98, and it helped him win 2001 and 2004. So he's got this clear values-based proposition. Again, I know it's a totally different marketplace, heaps of different things about American politics, but I thought Kamala Harris is great, loved her. What a fabulous candidate, intelligent person, really capable looking. But what did she really genuinely, passionately believe in that made her different to any other member of the Democratic Party? I honestly don't know. I watch it that closely. Donald Trump, I'm really clear about his values. He's a racist, misogynist, and a nutbag, right? Conspiracy theorist. I know his values. So even though his values are actually quite odious to most people, including most Americans and nearly all Australians, at least I know who he is and what he stands for and believes in. So the number one thing is to showcase your values. And in fact, as well as the hard work at the local level, the local candidate that ought to be doing that too. So, what is it that the Allen Labor government is going to do to say, well, these big things are going to happen that are going to, and they've done some great stuff on housing and some great stuff on climate. How do you sort of, as I would sometimes describe, make a pig of yourself on those? How do you make a splash about them and be willing to take heat? In fact, court controversy. I don't know if Daniel Andrews ever deliberately courted controversy, but his manner was just such that he was electrifying and you always knew what he believed in. And you pretty much always knew that he was in your corner. So I think if look for the controversy, manufacture the controversy that can showcase your values and that those values in turn show that you connect with people and are fighting for them. Now, I know that's not a specific issue thing, and I genuinely, when I go and talk to leaders or parties, whatever, I don't particularly mind. I just say, what do you really believe in and you're passionate about? Right, how are we going to get that out to people?
To add to that, I 100% agree with that, John, and I add to that as well. I think sometimes there are certain politicians and people in public leadership broadly. There are those that want to be liked and there are those that want to be respected. And likability is fundamentally a different frame than respectability. And the problem about acting like you want to be liked, when eventually you do something that pisses someone off, I don't like you anymore. And therefore that relationship is now broken. Whereas if it was always built on the respect, whether I like you or not is immaterial, but I respect you. And though, people respected John Howard, they didn't like him, but they still went and voted for him. People didn't like, there was an element there that people didn't like Daniel Andrews, but they respected him. And I think it is because leaders make tough decisions, and that's when they earn that respect from the voting population. So to the point that you're saying, do something controversial. A lot of it is around making tough decisions, and voters will look at that and go, I respect that. That wasn't easy. And sometimes they'll go, I don't actually agree with it.
Yeah, I think that, seeking to be liked is a bit of a mug's game, but I think if you have in your head, and anyone who's an aspiring politician and listening, if you've got one thing in your head, like, I'm not asking you to change your values at all. I mean, I think a whole range of different things can be popularly supported if they're well expressed. So, what are the things you really believe in, and how are you going to, how do people know that you're fired up about it? Because when you're fired up about it, people know you're fair dinkum about it. When you're using this, it's funny you were saying that thing about want to be liked. You know what I reckon that is one of the key drivers of disaster in politics is fear. People fear the wrath of the electorate. And as soon as you're frightened, you're not willing to do stuff. You're worried those people won't like you. And I think you just got to have courage and you've got to do something that you believe in. And how'd you be anyway? If you managed to somehow get in there and you've got elected and you're the leader of a state or a country and this is Malcolm Turnbull, manage things satisfactorily as you go along and didn't ever really do the things he believed in on climate. And he can now reflect on his time and just be bitter that he was knifed, because he can't say that he stuck his neck out and was willing to take a risk and was willing to become unpopular when he was so popular when he was elected. And he actually really died a death of not living up to his values that he used to express so clearly. So, have a bit of courage to stick your neck out and believe in something. And you know what? People will go, I reckon I believe in that too. And, there are values-based propositions often on both sides of the argument, right? Like, think about I've got my unionist T-shirt on. Ordinary working people ought to have a reasonable opportunity to share in the profit of the businesses that they help to make profitable. That is a reasonable thing to say, right? Equally, someone who sticks their neck out and starts a business, ought to be able to reap the rewards of that. These are sort of politically sort of opposites, but they're actually not, expressed like that. Neither is particularly abhorrent to the other. You see, so it doesn't matter that 45% might be on your side and 55 on the other. If you've passionately expressed it and said why you believe in that, then I think that you've cast yourself as someone who seems to have the moral rudder that is appropriate. So for 99.9% of pieces of legislation and policy decisions a government makes, the public will never know. They sort of know they'll never know. But what they want, what they're looking for, is someone who they share values with. And you want to find out how if you want to just experiment with this, ask someone what they do when they vote in local government. There's rarely any parties involved. I know in some states a bit, but there's not usually a party involved. I'm just trying to read these boring, monotonous blurbs that are all the same to try and find a values connection with one of these candidates. That's what voters are hunting for. Well, you've got to show them your values and you've got to articulate them with passion.
You talked about it from the perspective of, I guess, at a national or a state level. And I just want to sort of touch on maybe a bit more specific in terms of the Western MPs. There's been so much commentary over almost like since I left head office in 2018, 2019, I think that this is sort of this conversation about don't neglect the West and this is going to be a problem for the Labor Party in the future. And if we're talking about sort of how can Labor at a leadership level be more accountable and be better? I also want to just talk about how at a local level we can be better. And I couch these remarks by saying this comes from a place of love. And as a former party official, I certainly always try to conduct myself in such a way that I always was honest and upfront with MPs and candidates, as opposed to telling them what they wanted to hear. I sort of talked to them about how we could be better. And so this is where I'm coming from as well when I say these things. But I think historically, the Western and to a degree as well, Northern MPs, both at a state and a federal level, it's been a different culture out there compared to the East and the Southeast. The most competitive election for a Labor candidate or MP was their pre-selection, not their election, and it was a place where we historically have rewarded, factional loyalty or people who have worked the branches or former union officials that we put them in, or future ministers as well, right? We put them out in these safe Labor seats. And for a long time, a lot of those MPs didn't even live in their electorates. And I actually try to work out which ones currently, both state and federal, reside in their electorates. And there still are MPs that don't live in their electorates out in the West. And for a long, long time, we got away with that. They didn't have to campaign election time. There wasn't an expectation from head office for them to campaign election time. But clearly those days are over. And no seat now should be taken for granted. You cannot be an absent MP anymore. And now they, for the first time, are experiencing a backlash from their own people, and they're panicking. And I get that. I completely understand. It's a natural human reaction. Your job's on the line, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on. And I also think that there's probably a little bit of lack of historical, reflection on the historical behaviour and culture out in the West, and I think things need to change. And I will say this: there is a newer generation of MPs that are coming through in the West that are starting to change that culture. I certainly am not going to name names, because by naming names, I'm excluding other names, and then the people will start to think that I'm actually having a crack at a certain particular MP, and I'm not. But broadly speaking, when I was a party official, there was a view by caucus members outside of the West that they had it easy and they were lethargic campaigners at best. And I really, you were talking before, John, about the types of voters that live in the West and the experiences of those voters. And I just genuinely don't think – I think that the northwest of metropolitan Melbourne is a mirror to the outer southeast metropolitan Melbourne. There's old working class white and migrant communities that had moved there because of an industrial base. There is growth corridors, like new homes being built that are bringing in new families, but from new migrant mixes. That's happening in both parts of metropolitan Melbourne, in the northwest and in the southeast. But if you look at seats like Cranbourne, the Narries, Pakenham, they are very similar makeups to those seats out in the west. But the difference is that the approach by those local MPs in the southeast has been to be very proactive in their approach. Campaign to those constituencies, sell the announcements that government are doing, holding onto those seats for grim life. Like Pauline Richards in Cranbourne was absolutely bricking it at the last state election that she was going to lose her seat, and she worked her ass off, right? Broadly speaking, there is a culture amongst southeast and outer eastern suburban MPs that they campaign hard, whereas the view of the Western MPs is that they are always publicly complaining about not getting enough government investment. And funnily enough, that strategy is bonkers, because what you're doing is you are making an argument to your voters to not vote for you, because you are saying, I am inept at my job. I cannot deliver for you. And I understand what the strategy is. The strategy is the MP is trying to say, no, I am a protagonist with you, and I'm pointing my fingers with you at the government. But voters don't see it that way, because voters see that MP as, no, you're the government. You should be delivering for me. And if you're not delivering for me, I'm going to vote you out. And so there needs to be there's got to be a change in mindset, right? Because it's not as if there isn't been, okay, sure, more should be done for the West. I'm not disputing that. But there has been a lot of investment go out in the West. And I'm not a policy person, but even off the top of my head, I can name like the Westgate Tunnel, level crossings. There's been like 35 brand new schools built out in the West out of 100 across the state. The Footscray Hospital, for God's sake, is bigger than bloody Chadstone. So there's a whole bunch of things out there. But, first things I would be doing would be, one, if you're a Western MP, get a Campaign Central login to start with. 2, go out and hang out with a Pauline Richards or a Jackson Taylor for a week, if you haven't already done that, and spend time with them and watch what they do in terms of campaigning, and then go back home and then go talk to the rest of your caucus members and start to work together, because you can turn this around, This isn't over, but this is a teachable moment, and we all have to stand. This finger pointing at each other isn't going to solve anything. We all need to put our hands up and say, hey, we all probably could do better, and let's hold each other account and make some changes before the next poll. Otherwise, we are all fucked.
Look, I've done some research in some funny seats at different times, different organisations trying to get different policy up or get me to go to the independent seats or something. And I remember in Tony Windsor's seat, and even Bob Catter's. They're sitting down here where you think Bob Catter's a bit of a nutbag. Let me tell you, if you have got a pothole that is the council's problem, if you've got a problem with the local school that is the state government's problem, much less anything federal, if you live in Bob Catter's seat, you ring Bob's office, and you know what happens? It gets fixed. Imagine the poor local government worker gets that force of nature, Bob Catter, on the phone shouting to him about a pothole. It gets done. He's just a fanatic at representing people and getting stuff done. And a lot of it isn't even almost everything that touches people's lives is not the federal government, right? Has a federal independent member survived like that? Well, he shares their values and he showcases that all the time in deliberately controversial, funny often sorts of ways. But he's just doing the work. And same thing with Tony Windsor. Like, he's an immensely successful independent. And These guys are just out there getting stuff done. Like if you can't fill out the form for Centrelink, they are filling it out for you, and they're lodging, and then they're nagging that poor public servant to get it processed. It's just your job is to advocate and stand up for people. People, so many times, I've had the great displeasure of having to try and fill out some my aged care forms for my old man, and I like to think I know my way around a government form. It's hard. And there's tons of things, there's endless opportunities to turn your electorate office into a machine that solves people's problems. I've got to tell you a story I should never confess to, but this is how these things work. I got elected to my local council when I was 18 years old, right? And I didn't know what I was doing, but I suppose I slowly got better over the 7 years I was there. And I'd probably been in about 3 months, and a bloke rings me up and he starts complaining to me that there's a block in his street and everyone's house proud except this block. It's got rubbish and long grass and it's crap. And I'm sort of about to say, well, what do you want me to do about it when he lands me with and the reason I'm calling you is, you know who owns it? The council. And he wanted me to fix. He's been nagging these engineers for a year. He wanted me to get something done. I got to confess, I completely forgot. So when he rang up a week later, I thought, Jesus Christ, I haven't done anything about it. I could have got it fixed, of course, and I forgot to. And he just rang me up to say thanks because, the day after he rang me, the lawnmowers were out from the council. And what had happened is that the engineers have listened to him over the last year and got it done. I don't know, this is a false truth, but he thought I was a bloke who got a little thing done. And, of course, I think I secured my future by saying, well, is there anything else you ever need done, mate? You know who to call. And, of course, ever since then, I did try to actually respond with greater alacrity. It's that sort of stuff, right? Like just that little retail stuff. Get some of the I was a mayor down there for a while too, and I tell you what, when you got 200 annual general meetings of everything from the Historical Society to the university to the Third Age, it's a bit of drudgery going around to those 200 annual general meetings. Get out to them all. Talk to people. You'll get known. People will see that you're out there. They'll get to like you, and even if they don't like your politics, they'll get to respect that you're a person that gets stuff done. Basically, work hard. I actually reckon there would be a bit to be said for getting some of those highly competitive, almost professional electorate office workers, pay them something to move from the southeast and get them out in the north and west. Some great electorate officers that are actually doing most of that work are fabulous, and I'd be working my ass off to recruit them rather than seeing it as a bit of a plum job for someone who helped my most important election is the pre-selection. Well, maybe next time that's not going to be the most important election.
I wanted to talk about federal politics, but I'm looking at the time and we're almost done. So I actually think that we might close the show out here, but we're going to have to get you back on again to talk about federal politics as we get closer and closer to the election. So I just want to close out with one other sort of get some thoughts from you, because obviously there was the other by-election that was held last weekend. I like how they called it Super Election Saturday. It was like two elections. It's not exactly a super thing. Anyway, Prahan happened. Labor didn't contest. It was a Greens v Liberal contest. It looks like the Libs are going to get up. Just reading the sort of the Fairfax and Guardian articles of the fallout from the Greens' loss there, the immaturity of Ellen Sandell, the leader of the Greens, in her inability, talk about lack of accountability, her inability to take this on the chin and say, yeah, okay, here's some areas there we did wrong, it just spoke to how immature that party is, that they're feeling the pressure. They're starting to drop seats. They're losing seats. They're in the news for all the wrong reasons. There's a national backlash against folks like Max Chandler, Mathers, installing legislation, and voters are starting to tire from the Greens and they're feeling it. And instead of them saying, hey, because remember, John, as you and I know, the voters are always right. But for them to start pointing the finger at everyone else except for themselves, I just thought was interesting. And I'm like, you have not learnt this lesson. And may you continue to not learn this lesson. I'd like you for not to learn this lesson up until the next federal election and the next state election in Victoria.
Yeah, look, I think for people in the state, Prahan's a really interesting seat. It's one of those seats, genuinely weird three-cornered contest where Liberal, Labor or Green can win and sort of historically have, but it's inched a little bit more towards the Greens over recent elections, hence Labor didn't sort of field a candidate. Green vote, I don't know if it went up or down, but it was basically the same as last time. So hang on, Labor pulls out with a huge chunk of the vote, third biggest chunk of the vote, and none of that seemed to lead to an increase in vote for them. One thing I would give them as a little bit of a leave pass on is, although climate change is an existential threat to the entire species of humanity, most people don't see it that way. They see it as a bit of a trade-off. I'd like to do something for nature, but, our kids' future and that, but I'm a bit worried about the economy. So, environmental issues, even though climate is actually a massive economic issue, is probably part of it. I've been wondering at this for years, Stephen, right? I started doing polls 25 years ago. And you know what the Greens were doing really well with? Under 30s. Like really, really well. And you know who they're doing really well with now? Under 30s. Like, hang on. Like, I was under 30 then, nearly, maybe just 30. So why aren't the under 30s of the turn of the century still voting for them? And it's really interesting that language you used about immaturity. I reckon the Greens began as this sort of university protest kid party sort of thing. If I hear some youngster out of a university angry and protesting and a little bit too idealistic and a little bit not practical, you know what I think? God bless them. 21, 22 years old, fired up, a little bit holier than thou about their values. Good on them. I hear that from some 40-something leader of the Greens. I just think, grow up. I've got no objection to that posture. It is not a posture of a party that is going to win some of the people in the middle. I'd be interested to look at the age demographics of Prahan, right? It probably was they're probably just losing some of these university kids, and younger people have got a bit older. Life changes when you get into your 30s and get kids, and, money matters a bit more for practical reasons, not less values driven. I think for the Greens, more than policy, it is posture, and I think their posture is one of petulance, and that is not a fair income party that is going to start to consistently win votes. And, they about a third of 18-year-olds will be planning on giving them their primary vote, and at 10 or 15 years later, the same people are not. Their vote has not gone up or down much, really. If you try and do a bit of a statistical analysis of it across the country, it's just sitting around about where it's been for a long time. But even look at Bob Brown, I think, is this sort of fabulous statesman of Australian politics, a really admirable human being, but he had that petulance about him, right? He would stand up in the parliament and shout at the leader of the United States or China, and, that's not exactly a mature thing to do. No disrespect to Bob, who is a bit of a legend, but I reckon that's exactly what their problem is. They need to grow up as a party and behave like they're grown-ups.
That tracks, John. I was talking to someone who is a Prahan voter who is in his mid-30s, now got a family, runs his own, he's a tradesman, runs his own business, historically had voted Greens all through his youth, and at this election voted for Tony Lupton, actually, the Labor Independent, but had sort of said, I'm off the Greens. I've had enough. Like, I don't know what they do. And so I was like, okay, interesting. More of that, please. We'll watch this space. Now, as I said, John, we'll have to get you back on again because there's so much more to talk about. There's obviously a federal election happening later this year, and I want to talk to you more about the messaging and the framing of the two major parties heading into this poll. So we're just going to have to organise another time for you to come back on today. I knew at the start of the show when I said to you, and I said publicly on the actual show, here are our intentions for today's episode. I thought, I got a funny feeling we're just going to talk all about Werribee. But anyway, I should know better next time. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We look forward to talking to you in the near future and continue to work on that wonderful garage you've got there in the background.
Yep. This is my inner city garage. Yeah. You can imagine when I was out in the sticks, it was about an acre bigger than that, my shed. Anyway, I've lost something there. Look, really looking forward to getting into that federal thing. It's really going to be red hot. It's an absolutely hot contest. Because I'm a Labor guy, I feel pessimistic, which means really that I think it's tight. I'm always pessimistic when it's tight. So I think it's going to take a lot of hard work and good thinking and good strategising. So a lot of things to think and talk about the federal election that's going to be getting us all electrified in the next few months.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. And special shout out to our latest Patreon subscriber, David Fagg. Thanks, David, for joining our Patreon podcast community. Like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.